judge standing. Good evening. I want to start, of course, by thanking the organizers for the tremendous job they have done. They have shipped me over here from Canada to the UK to here, so I'm very glad to be here with you tonight for the first National BDS Conference in Australia. It's a real privilege and honor to be here. And I thank the organizers and thank every one of you for coming out tonight, because it's a Friday evening and you could have been home watching a very bad television show on Australian television, but instead you're here. So I congratulate every one of you for making the effort to come out as well. I'm presuming Australian television is as horrid as Canadian television. I start every speech by always saying, my name is Rafeef Ziadah. I'm a refugee from occupied Palestine, soon to be free Palestine. Earlier this year, an Israeli think tank, the Reut Institute, declared Toronto, a city in which I have been living and organizing for the past 7 years, declared it a hub of delegitimization, and said that the growing campaign calling for boycott, divestments, and sanctions against Israel has become a strategic threat. They listed other states, other cities around the world, including Madrid and London. Here's what I'm hoping for out of this conference. That by the time you have your next one in the next year or the next 2 years, that we can add a whole list of Australian cities to the hubs of delegitimization. Australian activists were key activists in shutting down South African apartheid. It's time to make history again by shutting down Israeli apartheid. And this weekend we're going to begin doing that together. So thank you again for coming out. Now, what the Reut Institute also said, and again, this is an Israeli think tank, and I think it's very impressive to look at how they talk about boycott, divestments, and sanctions. And they say this delegitimization hub is trying to tie Israel's military hands through the use of non-military tools, such as international law. Shame on us. We're trying to use international law. And to that, I say yes, it is very true. BDS movement has been based on very clear principles of human rights and international law, and that includes a very strict anti-oppression politics that excludes all forms of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and colonial oppression. These are clear demands and stands of the Palestinian BDS movement. These principles of BDS are summarized in the 3 key demands that are in the call for BDS that came signed by more than 170 Palestinian civil society organizations. And oftentimes when people speak about the BDS movement, they neglect what the demands of the movement are. Oftentimes there's a theoretical debate about boycott, but let's actually talk about what this movement is calling for. Because it's very simple. Oftentimes, when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, people say this is very, very complicated. It will take you so long to understand it. If you look at the 3 demands of BDS, I think it's very clear to understand. The first one, ending the occupation and dismantling the apartheid wall. It would be very interesting to have somebody argue that military occupations of another people are a great thing, especially if speaking in Australia or a country like Canada. So this is the first demand, ending the occupation. One people should not be oppressing another people through the use of military tanks, M16s, F-16s, an entire network of Israeli-only roads, networks of checkpoints, controlling every aspect of Palestinian life. The BDS movement is saying, and this is according to international law, that ending the occupation is one of the demands. The second demand, equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. Look at that. Now that's a radical demand, calling for equality. I mean, when we speak about liberal democracies, the first thing they tell us is, all citizens are equal. Well, great. If Israel wants to call itself a democracy, then we would like all its citizens to be equal. Palestinian citizens of Israel are treated as second-class citizens. Just to give you a simple example, if you look at the job application, they require you to say whether you have served in the Israeli military or not. Palestinian citizens of Israel do not serve in the military. So that immediately shows them to the employer as being Palestinian, and they do not get a majority of jobs. Another way they're discriminated against, there is the issue of unrecognized villages. These are villages where Palestinian citizens of Israel, these are citizens of the state, live in villages that the state of Israel does not want to recognize. So they get no services, no water, no sewage, because these were villages inhabited that formed after the ethnic cleansing of 1948, where people ran away and lived in these villages, or the Israelis simply didn't include them in the census when they took over that territory. So these are unrecognized villages where citizens of the state are not given services. So we are talking about the treatment of citizens of the so-called democratic state of Israel being treated as second-class citizens. And lastly, and this is usually the litmus test, this is the last demand of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, and it's the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Now this is the one that the Zionists really go crazy over. And here I just want to say that any one of you can go to Palestine, if you're not Palestinian. And if you happen to have any Jewish relations in your family, you can go and live there, start a family there. You can even get a subsidy from the Israeli government to go there. My grandfather died in a refugee camp, never having been able to see Haifa before he died. This is the apartheid state of Israel. To say that people like me are not allowed to go back because of our religion. And by the way, I'm not Muslim. People like to think of this as a Jewish-Muslim Byzantine hatred that's been going on for years. It's not. This is a very modern struggle that started with the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. And that's why the right of return is the key demand of the BDS movement. Because the struggle today for Palestinian freedom and human rights started when the State of Israel was created in 1948, based on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Not only were 750,000 refugees thrown out into the sea, and I think it's very useful to use that analogy, not only did that happen, the 500 villages were destroyed, the names of places were changed, and Palestinians were deemed non-existent. Up to this day, I can be standing in front of a Zionist and saying, I am Palestinian, and they will say, no, there's no such thing as a Palestinian, because that is the basis of the Zionist myth. A home without a people for a people without a home or a land, or that saying they love to say. Only problem is there was a people, they were the Palestinian people. We never got a vote on whether Israel needs to be created on our land or not, and we were thrown out. And this is very common of all settler colonial states. I think it's very important to always ground the call for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions in these three demands. Because when people try to argue that whether this is anti-Semitic, whether this is targeting the state of Israel, it's international law on basic human rights. If Israel wants to act outside of international law, then yes, it will be targeted. If Israel is going to act like a pariah state that surrounds the Gaza Strip, puts it under a medieval siege, and then bombs the civilian population in an act of collective punishment, then yes, it will be treated as a pariah state. It's very simple. If you act like a pariah state, you end up being treated like a pariah state. There's nothing that complicated about it. Now, the BDS movement is also formed on analysis of Israel as an apartheid state. But using the term apartheid is not simply descriptive or for comparative reasons. It's very important analytically. And it's also very important to say that there is an international convention on the suppression and punishment of the crime of apartheid. So when South African apartheid ended, people did realize it could happen again, and this is why this UN convention exists. And I encourage everyone to go and actually read this convention and see for yourself and read all the books. And the best way you can learn is to actually